My name is Mona Nasser, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very sorry I'm not able to be in person there. Me and Rob tried, but it didn't work out. I'm the director of the Plymouth Institute of Health and Care Research and a professor in clinical epidemiology at University of Plymouth. I'm also a founder of a small research community we call the Meta Futurism Lab, which you learn more about it here. Um, Rob asked me to talk about this bringing together cultures and discipline for immersive experiences. I think the reason Rob asked me to give this talk was we worked together on an initiative I call the Meta Futurism Lab. I confessed when I started it, it was supposed to be just for fun, but it ended up to become a quite serious project at some stage. We went when I started it early on, and then gradually other people joined it. We first just were kind of trying to address a problem and run the workshops, but then we had some time and reflected what we are actually doing. So what we're doing in the Meta Futurism Lab, we're trying to reimagine reimagine the future, but do it in a way that's grounded in scientific methodology and bring some level of meta thinking in it, and provide an inclusive environment so we can have different ideas from different cultures and different communities in the storylines. When we started years ago, we were a smaller group. We have expanded, and we had a lot of people coming in and coming out. At the moment, the community I have is co-led by myself, Yvette, and Pam. And Rob has a very big role also in helping us to run this community. So it started years ago by a very specific question I had. I'm a clinical researcher, and I was working with the European Space Agency, and I felt like they could be a bit more imaginative about how we do research in the future. I'm also somebody who's a sci-fi fan, and I find it sometimes a bit disappointing how the future of medical research is seen in sci-fi. It was very linear and very unimaginative. There are exceptions, like the Voyager, Star Trek Voyager had some really interesting ones about this invisible aliens doing studies on us, or the episode that was like using a hologram to do simulation that they before they do a test on a human. So there are exceptions, but a lot of science fiction. There could be a better. There's a lot more work we have done in my methodology of clinical research that could have been in there. So this kind of ideas ended up in we got together with a group of people in a hospital in the UK. We got everybody together and make them to imagine they're on Mars and trying to handle an epidemic. I have to say, when we made the scenario, despite the similarities it has with COVID-19, we had no idea that would happen then. The first time we ran the workshop, we had a simulation lab in the Torbay Hospital available to us. However, we realized we cannot always run it with we don't always have to access to it, and we wanted to find ways to run these workshops more often and to explore more ideas. So we ended up realizing that actually one of the most strongest immersion tools is actually a science fiction story itself. When we started the story with in on the Mars, and that was our initial storyline. And we kind of exploring how people kind of manage it in there. The positive thing is that the scenario on Mars is quite close to us. It's very similar to Earth, and people feel still connected to the Earth, which provided some interesting help to the participants how they engage with the scenario. One of the things that became quite clear in the scenario is that one of the factors that drives the imagination of the people and kind of helps them to imagine the thing is the uncertainties that we have embedded in the storyline. We left certain things in the storyline to the uncertain. We didn't answer the question. We let those gaps of information in there that helps people to fill them up. For example, the example is that we gave them an epidemics, but we gave them some of the symptoms, but we don't give them all of the details required to make a decision, because in reality, you usually don't have all of this information. You still have to navigate and respond and manage it. It became quite clear at the beginning that the immersive tool was not only a helpful tool for imagining future, but also about how people handle uncertainty in difficult situations. So The first few workshops we ran, which was one Horbe Hospital, we ran some of them University of Plymouth, we ran one with International Space University. They were quite always the standard story of in Mars. But one of the things we started to do was I started to kind of evolve the story. Every time I run the workshop, the story evolves a bit further to the next storyline, and it continues like that. One of the workshops that kind of gave me kind of an insight, an interesting insight, and a different insight about how we run this workshop was a workshop we ran virtually for the Rhode Island School of Design. I think it was 2020 or 2021. It was during the pandemic we did that. And the interesting thing was, so in order to make an immersive experience, you build the worlds. So you give people characters, you build cultures, you make rituals. One of the interesting things was that people come up with things that I didn't expect that it would happen. And those were quite important in to realize that immersion is not always happening linearly. It can happen more dynamically and in patterns that we didn't expect. I use a tea drinking one because um, in order to make the story immersive, I have like put for one of the characters that they had an interest in making tea and making teapots from Martian Martian soil to get a special taste of tea. And one of the things I didn't expect it was that one of the students, because the students were given the scenario, this is the epidemic, this is happening, you need to manage the scenario and provide research, and we'll teach them how to design the research. The student came up that the tea is the solution of the problem, which wasn't something I expected. It was just to make an immersive and give somebody a character put in there. But people picked it up, which kind of shows that you cannot always kind of control how people engage in a storyline and respond to it, and you need to give them and the way they choose the different options of it, give you an insight about how people perceive that scenario. Most of our workshops at that time was around mouse. We did one workshop that was an asteroid. That was an interesting one because it was a bit of an in response to what's happening with COVID, and we wanted to help people to kind of immerse in that scenario. Was that during COVID time, we all were in small places in our houses, so we wouldn't go outside, so we couldn't see the horizon or distance, and our eyes were only seeing things nearby. And I thought that asteroid was an interesting example because it's a closer object, but then is the infinity of the universe beyond it. So it kind of brought the same feeling in there. Interesting thing in that workshop was we gave the participants the option to choose their own characters. They could choose a character we gave them or create their own one. And somebody created a stowaway. If you like me are not a non-native English speaker, a stowaway is somebody who hides on a ship illegally and tries to get a ride. That was not something I was like planning my scenario. Most of my characters in the scenario were quite clear. It was the engineer, there was a doctor. So the stowaway was a bit of an unusual kind of disruption of reality, but it was quite. We realized related that this disruption is quite important in people to get immersed in a scenario and take ownership of it. So this was a bigger event we had. We run it in Belgium. There was a performance art school in there that they let us run it. And this one, we started a new storyline because up to now we had in Mars, and we started an exoplanet. Exoplanets are planets that are they're planets that are circulating other stars. And it would give a bit of a distance because you can be a more extreme different scenario when you're on another planet rather than on Earth or on Mars or even on an asteroid. And the workshops was part of a bigger event that was around climate crisis and space exploration. And what we did was we put people on the tidal lock planet. Tidal lock is when one side of the planet is always towards the star and one side is away. So one side is really hot, one side is very cold. And we're exploring the whole thing about the extreme temperature. During one of the participants some of the participants in the workshop, they were creating a new species on that planet. The interesting thing was we taught the students unlike the other four scenarios, we actually gave them a bit more because we had a whole day, more time to build the whole society with us and then try to solve the issue they had. The interesting thing was the way they built the society was no way what I expected. First of all, despite the two work groups were quite separate, and I should just give you context of the performance arts students in their 20s, they all of them consider like sexuality as one of the reproduction of sexuality as a central theme in their workshop. So so they had both stories, like sex was for pleasure and reproduction was a separate issue to produce. And they had all, in order to kind of make a sustainable society, they kind of got really engaged in this idea of death and life. And even the issue of suicide came out. To be transparent, I think what they were referring to was euthanasia, not suicide. But it was a bit of a topic that was kind of might have been an uncomfortable one, but actually the group was exploring it comfortably and kind of widely. And but one of the interesting things was that at the end of the workshop, because they had in the afternoon they had to deal with a disease that was affected. The disease was that the people have weird temperature changes in the body. It was an unusual disease that was kind of unfamiliar. But because they had to come up with a solution, one of the groups said the fact that having the freedom to kind of explore the society again and try to find a solution was very liberating, especially with the whole challenges that COVID introduced to the society. Yeah, and one of the other things that was interesting was that they were trying to make a new society, and they realized some of the plans they came up messed up other parts of the society, and they kind of it was a bit of an understanding of the interconnectedness of the society. We continued this workshop and we tried to explore new things, and one of them was about exploring language and relation with other species. And in one of the future workshops, this was some of the virtual workshops we organized, and people started to create poems on how to create it, even creating new species rights charters. They were thinking if we were a different society, we were more connected to other species, how the charter the revised human rights charter that includes other species would look like. They started to create new words and sometimes new calligraphy for the boards, and it kind of brought in another angle of all of the elements you can choose and attach, but also how the choices of word and the existence of the words kind of changes how we perceive the society and how I engage with them. Um, so yeah, when we had a lot of our workshop were run in virtually or in Europe in person, and despite we had people from different cultures, like from including like Philippines, Malaysia involved. I think predominantly there were Europeans, but with like a few people from other countries. Then we had organized a workshop that was for Filipino students, so they were all mostly like art students who were engaging as part of a hackathon in this workshop, and it was very interesting because the story we brought from Europe in there, because what we did was this was the evolution of the previous story. So every workshop, the storyline would be evolved to the next one. So the students of the next workshop would have elements from the previous discussion in the next one in there, even if the next one was another specific context. First of all, you could see quite a different attitude about some of the elements of the storyline with the new community. Like the Filipinos felt like the ambitions and the desire to be improving themselves in the society seems a bit like an addiction. Like when we run in Europe, was seen as a virtue, but in Philippines, this Filipino group students felt like an unhealthy addiction, which was interesting about how they explored it. This was also one of the groups that one of the students went quite far to write a whole new storyline, which was it was kind of interesting because at some stage she was exploring waste management on this planet, part of the building society. She came up with this story of we throw the waste into the sun. Which I have to say I didn't thought about it. At some stage she also wanted to make mini black holes to manage the waste, but I think it might be a lot of energy to do that. But it was really interesting how like the different exploration of ideas were going there. So yeah, that was the question I was asked, and being kind of loyal to this idea of like doing this evolution of the storyline, I actually tried to bring those addiction studies in there. One of the things I realized that when we were doing the first workshop, people are trying uh, to kind of predominantly being more positive elements or a negative one. I realized that the issue of a death on the previous one seemed as a negative one, but the way the students formulated before wasn't in a negative way. It was seen as a managed population management, but here was addiction was seen as a negative thing. And so we made it as part of the storyline, but also we kind of start exploring kind of other elements of like multilingual, like a language that has gestures and smells in it, and this also became into part of the storyline. Um, so the next one came up. It was trying to solve it was trying to integrate some different new scientific question in it, and ended up being on another moon of another exoplanet, an underwater community. And here it's going back to the issue about society and community. It was exploring if there is a community that the language and the existence requires a collective approach, and that was the underwater society. And one of the things we explored in that, because when we don't run the Filipino workshop, one of the things people said, oh, the society you build is very susceptible to colonization. So we tried to bring that conversation in. So we made this for the community that's scared of colonization from the rest of the planetary system, and how they try and ask people, how do you manage this true relation? That's a healthy relation between these two communities. Um, so continuing this trend, we sometimes we asked for workshop, we couldn't really be do very well with evolution because of the time. One of this was a children workshop we were supposed to run, and we couldn't bring in such a big storyline. But we ended up with a shorter storyline, and the end, this children did a planetary fashion show. They were dressing up as planets, so the children as planet dressed up. But it gave me an idea that kind of exploring something else is that it was about the moon and the underwater people, that to explore if in this community, um, the community would see the moon as a living being, how it would change the relation of it. And we had this whole group of people writing love letter to people who kind of believe in it or the moon itself. And it was kind of interesting because some people wrote love letters, but some people were exploring, okay, how do you express love to another planet or moon, and like how maybe you could use this, like the earthquake seismic relation of it as a way of engaging with it. So we have it became a quite big storyline. At some stage, we decided maybe we should start a new kind of line of stories in there. And as you might notice up to now, I have a big collaboration with people in Philippines. And one of my colleagues, Pamela Kajalik, she ran a speculative architecture workshop for her students. She was trying to teach the students around how to rethink about buildings, considering all of the flooding and disaster typhoons that happens in Philippines, and kind of rethink the relation with water. So the students came up with all of these beautiful sketches of different kind of buildings that could be working. And it was interesting. A lot of these buildings are collective communities rather than individual houses, and have quite interesting hierarchical systems. And after that workshop, I was supposed to run a Meta Futurism Lab workshop in a creative robotics program in University of Art London. So we thought, okay, we start with a flooded community, and with all of these buildings as a starting point of a new storyline. So that kind of role. The thing that was interesting is that the robotic students really engaged. They built new robotic systems. They kind of tried to rethink. They were even came up with the robotic systems who helps people to rethink about fashion in that society, to helping them um, with the housing. But one of the things feedbacks that I got from the students, the students a bit struggled to get immersed in that scenario. And it was interesting for me because the kind of difference when we took a story from Europe to Philippines, the Filipinos were much more comfortable to immerse in that scenario. But when it came from Philippines to Europe, I think the whole flooding disaster, because that's not an experience that's a lot happens in the UK. The students were more struggling to feel grounded in this storyline, which I thought was an interesting one about um, how we could familiarize people about reimagining scenarios between different cultures better. And you can also see the elements of it. During this workshop, we also saw kind of the elements of how different disciplines deal with the different workshops and ideas. I have to say, one of the groups that I found it most difficult to engage with in the story were sometimes engineers, because they kind of wanted to have a problem and solve it rather than reimagine the problem. And it wouldn't apply to all of them, but it was kind of interesting to see the different disciplines engaged differently. Some are very focused on the problem to solve, some are kind of feel the freedom to go different ways, and some try to find a middle ground hybrid with it. So yeah, so going back to, so we're continuing this trend of it. Um, Rob suggested we run a workshop metaverse. So that was our so we started kind of exploring running the workshop in a metaverse scenario. Although I have to say, mostly we use metaverse as a way of engaging with people rather than going to create the whole world. That was probably something we would be doing in the future around that. But the one of the interesting thing was when I started to talk with Rob about it is that we wanted to bring in the whole, like, the evolution of the storyline. A lot of it, so you see the whole issues about language, engagement with architecture, and others. But there was something else that it was clear that we didn't explore a lot, and it's very fundamental in a society. Is that how specific energy source in the community and how people deal with virtual reality affects the community. Um, and I think it's interesting that we didn't explore it earlier, but we could have done it more. Was that I moved a few countries now, and every time I move a country or I go to a new country and I want to understand it, one of the first questions I ask is, what is the main energy source in your country? I come from an oil country. I'm Iranian originally, so I know how much the source of energy can impact the culture of the community, economy, social relation. So it felt like when Rob came to me and said, "Oh, let's do that," I felt like we had a missed opportunity that we didn't explore more. So we started building these parallel boards that kind of explored different type of thinking about energy, both like, for example, we had one of these tidal like planets, and we had like we could have we would have using satellites in the orbit to use solar to help with the solar energy, and using the parts of this planet that's not inhabited to use that. We were exploring this idea of bioenergetic symbioses in the storylines, and we also thought about, especially with the bioenergetic, what was the interesting one to kind of connect to this idea of virtual reality and reality, because then um, if you have to use if you have a stake on it about how much you use that virtual reality in planning your life, and how much you use the real life. And so yeah, so that was another one of the kind of layers of the storylines we were exploring in there, to bring in new questions about it. I was hoping that if I managed to come to Tokyo, we would be able to run another metafuturism workshop there that is more connected to some of the issues that are happening every day, but unfortunately it didn't work out. But at the end, I want to say that I think the key things we run this workshop, one of the things I learned is it just not only helps us to kind of start to reimagine the future. The way we run the workshop helps us to bring in different cultural influences in the storyline, and provide different mediums that people can express in, from poetry, drawings, making prototypes, but also kind of explore, by having this evolutionary aspect to the storyline, we explore how, when different cultures come in, how they sometimes have conflicts, how they connect, and how they differ. I think the very obvious one is our moving between Philippines and Europe. That has been quite interesting to see how people engage with them differently. but also the kind of bringing in different disciplines on helping to emerging new ways of thinking and new ways of connecting things and ideas together. Um, One of the things that I didn't kind of go into detail, some of these workshops were used by design students or hackathons to actually develop new prototypes. So some of them actually had like practical prototypes made that they use in their projects, both in US and Philippines or in the UK, or performance pieces. And I'm hoping that we can use that more and more often as a kind of a medium to facilitate that. So thank you very much for listening for me. Please don't hesitate to come at me if you have any further questions. Hopefully I would be also there if all of the connection works and can answer your questions. Thank you.